continue our look at the Gospel of Mark, we go to the end of the 4th chapter. On that day, when evening had come, Jesus said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. Other boats were with them. A great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that the boat was already being swamped. But Jesus was in the stern, asleep on a cushion, and they woke him. And they said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" He woke up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." Then the wind ceased, and there was a dead calm. He said to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great awe, and they said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" Reading ends here. Last week we spoke of small size. We continue that a bit today, but we also today move to a giant, Goliath. Goliath was exactly the same size as Robert Wadlow, only big. Robert Wadlow as a tight end, big, 9 feet tall and built. I love sports, and my favorite sporting event is when a David goes against Goliath. I love when a little college team beats North Carolina or Duke or some big team, or when Notre Dame loses to Hawaii or someone. I love that idea in a movie, too, of the little person beating the system, or someone. I love the idea of David defeating Goliath. In the early narrative, just to set us up, David's dad tells him to keep the sheep safe and to go to where his brothers are in the battle. And he is to bring them provisions and special treats for their commander. David hears the taunt of the Philistine Goliath as their champion and says, "If you defeat me, we'll be your servants. If I defeat you, you'll be the servants of the Philistines." David asks, "What do you get if you beat this giant?" And David's told, "You'll be rich, you'll get the king's daughter, and you'll be famous." Sounds pretty good to David, but he's also filled with God's Spirit, and his honor has been attacked. How dare anyone speak like this to the anointed of Israel? His brother shoos him away and says, "I know what you're here for. You just want to watch the battle." And David responds like an annoyed teen. "What'd I do now? I was just asking a question." But he's brought before Saul. And he's handed the armament of Saul. But it's like a size 50 suit on a size 36 body. I just had this happen to me, and this almost never happens at my age. I went to one of the Middletown yard sales in Alton, so you know you're going to get special treats there. And I saw this guy had lined up beautiful shirts on the walkway, and I was ready to spend big money for the lot of the shirts. But for one of the rare times in my life, the gentleman was 2 or 3 full neck sizes bigger than me, if such a thing can be imagined. And as my mother would have said, I would have been swimming in his shirts. So sadly, I left them to someone for whom that fit. David can't wear the armor. So without armor, he goes to meet the Philistine. He walks down the hill and crosses a wadi, a dry creek bed, unarmed for all we know. But crossing the wadi, he notices 5 smooth stones and puts them in his shepherd's pouch. And then we find out he's armed with a sling. Ruth was careful to remind us that we're not talking about a slingshot that we used to try and hit people with when we were kids or try to kill a bird. But this was a sling as a weapon. I imagine it as something that you would do underhand, like a woman softball pitcher who can blow a ball past any male at 100 miles an hour with that underhand delivery. He moves across the valley of Elah toward the Philistine giant. The united forces of Israel are cowered in fear, but this boy without visible armament comes in. The giant moves to take him, to kill him. And with one blow of the sling, the rock embeds in his forehead and brings down the giant. David must have been afraid. But his courage comes from both God and his own ambition. He's moved past fear, I think, because he notices the 5 smooth stones in the dry creek bed. He sees them for weapons where I would have walked right past them. They were probably unnoticed by anybody on either side of the battle. But something so small, 5 smooth stones, was all David needed to bring down the giant, Goliath. In 2 Corinthians, Paul talks of weapons but removes any hint that they're violent. Paul says that the Christian community is possessed of weapons, possessed of resources, but they're non-violent resources to be used even against the Goliaths that we all face. Paul rattles off a terrible flurry of storms in his life, a series of physical Goliaths that would have laid anybody low. But like David, still he marches on for this new church he's caught a vision of. All he has are weapons of righteousness. He is convinced that these invisible weapons have real power in a stormy world. 5 smooth stones seem like nothing against Goliath. They're real weapons against these small, invisible weapons of Paul. They are just small items in our personal character quiver. And they often fail. At home, in the church, in the community. But sometimes they win even though all the odds are against us. Virtues like being forbearing, of demonstrating unfeigned, genuine love, of kindness. Anybody who inflicted all those wounds on Paul would have laughed at the weapons in Paul's quiver. But he was convinced that those were demonstrations of the power of God, the nonviolent power of God. Just for a moment, pick any of those. I want to underscore kindness. It's been said that rural people will do anything for you except give you a kind word. We go through life And we might see a bumper sticker to practice random acts of kindness instead of violence. But they seem so small, a kind word, a kind deed, a kind gesture, in a world that seems to grow more vulgar and unkind with every tick of the clock. But take a moment, just a moment, and reflect on a kind word or deed done to you. And realize how that kind deed may well have brought you to the place you are today. As I said, sometimes 5 smooth stones may miss. Those invisible weapons of Paul may well fail. Sometimes we need more help against the Goliath. We all face terrible storms, and terrible storms are a Goliath. When we face a Goliath, we get anxious and we want to flee. The apostles are the same way, but they're filled with anxiety, but they're stuck in the boat. Fear often paralyzes us because it catches us between fight or flight. Fear makes us blind, and we often can't see the weapons or the resources that are in front of us. But they have wit enough to try and get some help from Jesus, even though it's filled with anxiety. Instead of help us, we're drowning, they say, don't you care that we are perishing? And recall that a boat is an early Christian symbol of people being together on a journey, and yes, through storms. Jesus, a descendant of David, of the 5 smooth stones, then rebukes the wind. Hear that, rebukes the wind. He treats natural evil like an exorcism, like a spiritual evil. He casts out the evil of the storm that is threatening all their lives. I was very careful how I read the words, peace, be still. I wanted Jesus to sound like a therapist to the storm. I wanted Jesus to sound kind and gentle. But those aren't the words. It's a remarkably poor translation. What Jesus says is, be silent, be muzzled, just like he would speak to a demon that he was exorcising. And then he asks, why are you afraid? The word afraid could also be translated as cowardly. And the word that the NRSV is careful to translate is awe, to give a sense of reverence to the disciples, isn't that at all. It says the disciples feared a great fear. They were understandably afraid that they were going to die in their little boat. But they are more afraid of the immense power they have just seen at the disposal of Jesus. All these words show up not only in the healing of exorcisms, but when there's a storm, especially in Psalms, those words are words of the power of God. It is starting to dawn on them that they are in the midst of the very power of God. somehow in this guy that was asleep in the back of the boat. That same phrase is used when Jesus would heal people sometimes, that they were afraid. We had a bad storm on Monday at VBS, and the children reminded me of the disciples. They were afraid. Some of the thunder, some of the lightning, some of the very idea of a storm without mom or dad there. The next day, we put the two lessons together because most of the children missed the first lesson. And we talked about the storm that they had just witnessed. At the Nature Institute is a carved boat. It's almost exactly the same length of the boat that Jesus was in, but a good bit wider than the one at the Nature Institute. We put them in it and had them imagine that they were in a terrible storm like they were in the day before, and their eyes grew wide. One boy then stood up at the front of the boat and said, "Peace, be still," as they remembered that awful storm that pushed back some of our work there. They were all reminded that each one of them made it through that storm even though they were afraid. They were hunched and frightened, but they all made it through the storm. They all knew that they can't control the storms of life, but they learned once again that they could endure them and come out the other side. Sometimes we need Goliath to be taken care of, whether it's peace, be still, or be silent, be muzzled. I've used peace be still as a spiritual mantra for years. When I face pettiness, something deliberately, truly hurtful, or something truly large. Over the years, it gives me centered stability to fight anxiety, to have some security, and be able to fight the fear, and be able to see the resources that are at hand. All of us face storms. And looking back, we can realize it seems like a miracle that we've made it this far. Life is a storm. All of us are promised one day we will make it to the other side.